July 24, 1943. 180 miles south of the Japanese home islands, Pacific Ocean. The USS Tenosa cuts through dark water at periscope depth, her electric motors humming barely above a whisper. Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit presses his face against the rubber eyepiece, watching his target through the crosshairs. It's a Japanese tanker, the Tonin Maru No. 3, 19,000 tons of steel and oil, limping along without escort. No zigzagging, no destroyer screen, just a fat, defenseless prize steaming in a straight line at 8 knots. Inside the conning tower, condensation drips from the overhead pipes. The air is thick, hot, stale, with the breath of men who've been submerged for hours. Daspit's executive officer stands at his shoulder, plotting the firing solution on a mechanical computer that clicks and whirs with each input. Range, 900 yards. Angle on the bow, 90 degrees. A perfect broadside shot, the kind submariners dream about. Final bearing and shoot, Daspit says, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Set, the torpedo man responds from below. Fire 1. The deck shudders. A hiss of compressed air. A torpedo, 20 feet of steel packed with 600 pounds of Torpex explosive, leaves tube number 1 and accelerates toward the target at 46 knots. Through the periscope, Daspit watches the white wake trace a line across blue water. 45 seconds, 50 seconds, then impact. The torpedo slams into the tanker's hull, amidships with a metallic clang they can hear through the Tenosa's pressure hull. No explosion. Dud, someone mutters in the darkness. Fire 2, Daspit orders. Another shudder, another wake, another perfect hit against the tanker's side, another hollow clang echoing across the water. No explosion. The tanker continues steaming, oblivious or perhaps disbelieving its own luck. Daspit's jaw tightens. He's heard the stories. Every submarine commander in the Pacific has. Torpedoes that run too deep, passing harmlessly under their targets. Torpedoes that explode prematurely, their magnetic exploders triggered by the Earth's magnetic field instead of the target's hull. And torpedoes that hit perfectly but refuse to detonate. For 18 months, American submariners have been sent into combat with weapons that fail more often than they succeed. But Daspit is a methodical man, a Naval Academy graduate who believes in evidence. And right now, he has the rarest opportunity a submarine commander could ask for: an immobile target, no enemy escorts in sight, and time to conduct an experiment that might finally prove what everyone in the submarine force already knows. Fire 3. The pattern continues. Torpedo after torpedo slams into the Tonin Maru No. 3's hull with that sickening hollow clang. 4, 5, 6. The crew falls silent, watching their captain's face as he methodically empties tube after tube. 7, 8, 9. Each impact is perfect. These are textbook shots at point-blank range against a stationary target. 10, 11, 12, 13. With 2 torpedoes left in his tubes, Daspit finally orders, cease fire. Secure from battle stations. His executive officer stares at him. Skipper? We're taking the last 2 home, Daspit says, stepping back from the periscope. His voice is quiet, but carries the weight of revelation. If I fire them and they hit, the Bureau of Ordnance will say we missed. If I fire them and they explode, they'll say the others were fired incorrectly. But if we bring back duds, physical evidence, maybe someone will finally listen. 15 torpedoes fired, 11 hits, 2 explosions, an 80% failure rate against a target that couldn't maneuver, couldn't shoot back, couldn't even call for help. As the Tenosa turns away and the crippled tanker limps toward shore, Lawrence Daspit makes a decision that will change the course of the Pacific War. He's going to drag those 2 remaining torpedoes back to Pearl Harbor and force someone, anyone, to admit the truth. The Mark 14 torpedo, the U.S. Navy's primary submarine weapon, is fundamentally, catastrophically broken. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. When Japanese bombs fell on Battleship Row, the United States Navy possessed what it believed was the finest submarine torpedo in the world. The Mark 14 had been in development since the 1920s, refined through 2 decades of careful engineering. It was a technological marvel, a steam turbine propulsion system that left minimal wake, a sophisticated magnetic exploder that would detonate beneath a target's keel, breaking its back without even making contact, and enough explosive power to cripple a battleship. There was just one problem. It had never been properly tested. The Great Depression had starved the Navy of funding. Live-fire exercises were expensive. Each Mark 14 torpedo cost $10,000, equivalent to a small house. So the Bureau of Ordnance, the department responsible for naval weapons, conducted only 2 live-fire tests against actual ship targets. 2 tests for a weapon that would be expected to win a war in the Pacific. Both tests were deemed successful. Based on the flimsiest evidence, an explosion was observed. Therefore, the weapon must work. The magnetic exploder, officially called the Mark 6 exploder, had been tested exactly 0 times under combat conditions. It was considered too secret, too valuable to risk in peacetime exercises. The triggering mechanism that would detonate on contact, the backup system if the magnetic exploder failed, had been tested against steel plates and nets, but never against an actual armored warship hull moving at speed. When war came, American submarines went into battle carrying a weapon that existed more in theory than reality. Commander Marvin Kennedy of the USS Wahoo learned this the hard way on January 24, 1942, during America's first submarine patrol in Japanese waters. Kennedy stalked a convoy for hours, maneuvering his boat into perfect position. He fired a spread of torpedoes at a 10,000-ton freighter. Range, 800 yards. Track angle, perfect. His crew heard the impacts, solid hits against the hull. Nothing exploded. Kennedy watched through his periscope as his torpedoes bounced off the target like thrown rocks. The convoy steamed on, untouched. When he returned to Pearl Harbor and filed his patrol report, describing the torpedo failures in precise detail, the Bureau of Ordnance's response was swift and unequivocal. Commander Kennedy had miscalculated the firing solution. The torpedoes worked perfectly. The fault lay with the submarine commander. This became the pattern. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, submarine commanders returned from patrol after patrol with stories of torpedoes that ran too deep, exploded prematurely, or failed to explode at all. They described perfect setup shots gone wrong, enemy ships that should have been sunk but sailed away unscathed. They documented the failures meticulously, ranges, angles, depths, sea conditions, every variable they could measure. The Bureau of Ordnance rejected every report. The magnetic exploder was scientifically sound. The depth mechanism was calibrated at the factory. The contact exploder had passed all its tests. If torpedoes were failing, it could only be because submarine commanders were incompetent, cowardly, or lying to cover their mistakes. Meanwhile, men died. American submarines penetrated Japanese-controlled waters at enormous risk, stalked enemy convoys for days, maneuvered into firing position despite depth charges and escort vessels, only to watch their torpedoes fail. The psychological toll was devastating. Submariners began to lose faith in their primary weapon. Some commanders became hesitant, second-guessing their instincts. Others became reckless, firing excessive spreads of torpedoes in hopes that sheer volume might overcome the failure rate. The Japanese merchant fleet, which should have been crippled within months, continued operating. The Japanese war machine, dependent on imported oil and raw materials, remained well supplied. American submarines were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs, and the men in charge of designing their weapons refused to admit anything was wrong. But there was one admiral who believed his submarine commanders, one man who trusted the evidence of dozens of patrol reports over the assurances of bureaucrats who'd never heard a depth charge explode. One officer who was willing to stake his career on finding the truth. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood was about to go to war with his own Navy. February 1943. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Rear Admiral Charles Andrews Lockwood sits behind a desk stacked with patrol reports, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviews yet another account of torpedo failure. At 53 years old, Lockwood is a submariner's admiral, a man who spent years commanding submarines before rising to leadership. He knows what it's like to be in the control room when depth charges bracket your boat. He understands the courage it takes to press an attack against a well-defended convoy, and he trusts his commanders when they say their torpedoes don't work. The report in front of him is from the USS Trigger. Commander Roy Benson describes firing 4 torpedoes at a Japanese freighter at 1,200 yards. All 4 passed beneath the target without exploding. Benson's calculations were precise. His crew was experienced. His setup was textbook. But the Bureau of Ordnance would say he miscalculated depth settings. They always did. Lockwood removes his glasses and rubs his eyes. Since taking command of Submarine Force Pacific, he's read dozens of reports like this. The pattern is undeniable. When submarine commanders fire at shallow draft targets, destroyers, small freighters, ships riding high in the water, the torpedoes work reasonably well. When they fire at deep draft targets, loaded tankers and cargo ships sitting low in the water, the hit rate plummets. The logical conclusion: the torpedoes are running deeper than their depth settings indicate. But the Bureau of Ordnance insists this is impossible. The Mark 14's depth mechanism has been precisely calibrated. It's been tested. It works. Any failure must be operator error. Lockwood makes a decision. If the Bureau won't test the torpedoes, he will. He calls in Commander Jim Fife, a submarine officer with a reputation for innovative thinking. "I need you to design a test," Lockwood says. "We're going to prove these torpedoes run deep." "The Bureau won't like it, Admiral." "The Bureau isn't watching their men die because of faulty weapons. We are." They choose a location, Kahana Bay on Oahu's eastern coast, a shallow area where they can anchor a fishing net with torpedo heads mounted at precise depths. They'll fire torpedoes at the net and measure exactly how deep they're running. On a bright morning in March 1943, a submarine fires a Mark 14 torpedo set to run at 10 feet depth. Divers measure the hole it tears in the net, 11 feet. They fire another set for 20 feet. It runs at 21 feet. Another at 30 feet, 31 feet. Test after test confirms the same result. The Mark 14 consistently runs approximately 10 feet deeper than its set depth. 10 feet. That's the difference between a torpedo exploding under a ship's keel and passing harmlessly beneath its hull. That's why shallow draft destroyers are still being hit. The torpedoes run beneath their keels, but not beneath their hulls. That's why deep draft cargo ships are surviving. The torpedoes pass 10 feet below where they should be, missing entirely. Lockwood has his proof. He sends a detailed report to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, complete with measurements, photographs, and mathematical analysis. The response arrives 2 weeks later. The tests must be flawed. The depth mechanism cannot be defective. The Bureau recommends checking the submarine's depth gauges and the experience level of the officers conducting the tests. Lockwood reads the response twice, then carefully folds it and places it in his desk drawer. He picks up his phone and calls his submarine commanders to Pearl Harbor for a meeting. "Gentlemen," he tells them, standing before a room full of officers who've risked their lives with faulty weapons, "the Bureau of Ordnance says our tests are wrong. They won't fix the depth mechanism, so we're going to fix it ourselves. The solution is crude, but effective. Set every torpedo to run 10 feet shallower than the target's actual depth. If you want to hit at 20 feet, set the torpedo for 10 feet. If you want to hit at 30 feet, set it for 20. Compensate for the defect since the Bureau won't admit it exists." American submarines return to patrol with new orders, and suddenly hit rates improve. Ships that would have survived are now being sunk. The depth problem isn't solved. It's just being worked around. But Lockwood knows the Mark 14 has other problems. The magnetic exploder still causes premature detonations, and even when torpedoes hit perfectly, many still fail to explode. There are more battles ahead, and the Bureau of Ordnance is about to become very angry with the admiral who dared to question their engineering. April 1943. Somewhere in the Pacific. The USS Tullabee is stalking a Japanese transport when her commander sees a sight that makes his blood run cold. He's fired a spread of torpedoes, watched them track perfectly toward the target, then seen a massive explosion 600 yards short. The torpedo's magnetic exploder, designed to sense the target ship's magnetic field and detonate beneath its keel, has triggered prematurely. The explosion produces a towering column of water, impressive but harmless. The Japanese transport steams on, unaware it was just attacked. The Tullibee dives deep as escorts rush toward the explosion's location, dropping depth charges on empty water while the real threat slips away. This isn't an isolated incident. Submarine commanders are reporting premature explosions with alarming frequency, especially in the northern Pacific where magnetic field variations are more pronounced. The Mark VI magnetic exploder, the device that was supposed to make the Mark XIV torpedo devastatingly effective, is turning out to be a liability. The concept was brilliant in theory. Instead of requiring a direct hit, the magnetic exploder would sense the steel hull of an enemy ship passing overhead and detonate beneath it. The explosion's force, focused upward by the water, would break the target's keel, the structural backbone of any ship. A single torpedo could break a battleship in half. But theory and reality are proving to be very different things. The Earth's magnetic field varies with latitude, temperature, and geological features. The Mark VI exploder, so sensitive it could detect a ship's magnetic signature from beneath, is equally sensitive to these variations. Near volcanic islands, of which the Pacific has thousands, the magnetic field fluctuates wildly. Temperature changes affect the exploder's mechanism. Even firing the torpedo's steam turbine generates a magnetic field that can influence the exploder. Submarine commanders are adapting. Some are firing deeper, trying to keep their torpedoes far enough below the target that the magnetic exploder won't trigger until they are in proper position. Others are taking advantage of a feature few people know exists, a switch inside each torpedo that can deactivate the magnetic exploder, leaving only the contact exploder to detonate on impact. But deactivating the magnetic exploder requires opening the torpedo, accessing its internal mechanisms, and physically moving a switch, all while the torpedo is live and armed. It's dangerous work and officially prohibited. The Bureau of Ordnance has made clear that the magnetic exploder is not to be tampered with under any circumstances. Admiral Lockwood faces another decision. His submariners are telling him the magnetic exploder causes more problems than it solves. But disabling it officially would require approval from Washington, and the Bureau has already rejected his findings about the depth mechanism. If he orders his submarines to deactivate the magnetic exploders without authorization, he's effectively committing insubordination. He makes the call anyway. In May 1943, Lockwood issues an order to his submarine force. All Mark XIV torpedoes will be fired with magnetic exploders deactivated. From now on, American submarines will rely solely on contact exploders. Torpedoes must physically hit their targets to detonate. The Bureau of Ordnance responds with outrage. Lockwood is exceeding his authority. He's compromising torpedo effectiveness based on inconclusive field reports. He's undermining decades of careful engineering. They demand he rescind the order immediately. Lockwood refuses, and he sends them a copy of his patrol reports. Premature explosions have dropped to nearly zero. Hit rates are improving. His submarine commanders, no longer worried about their torpedoes exploding randomly, are pressing attacks with renewed confidence. The Bureau threatens to relieve Lockwood of command. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, backs his submarine force commander. The order stands. With the depth problem worked around and the magnetic exploder disabled, American submarines finally have torpedoes that reach their targets and detonate at the right time. Sinking rates begin to climb. The Japanese merchant fleet starts to feel the pressure. American submariners allow themselves to hope that maybe finally their weapons will work as designed. Then Lawrence Daspit returns from patrol with 2 unexploded torpedoes and evidence of an even more fundamental problem. August 1943. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The unexploded torpedo lies on a workbench in the submarine base's torpedo shop, its nose cone removed to expose the contact exploder mechanism inside. Admiral Lockwood stands beside it with a team of engineers, studying the device that has killed more American submariners' chances than Japanese ships. Lawrence Daspit's patrol report is definitive. 15 torpedoes fired, 11 perfect hits, 2 explosions. The Tonin Maru No. 3 should have been sent to the bottom 11 times over. Instead, 9 torpedoes bounced off its hull like hammers striking an anvil. "Show me how it works," Lockwood says. The senior engineer points to the contact exploders mechanism. When the torpedo hits the target, this plunger is driven backward by the impact. That releases the firing pin, which strikes the detonator here, which sets off the booster charge, which detonates the main warhead. And if the torpedo hits at a perfect 90-degree angle? The engineer hesitates. Sir? Daspit's hits were perpendicular, textbook shots. The torpedo nose struck flat against the hull. What happens to the firing pin when the impact is perfectly straight on? The engineer examines the mechanism more closely. The firing pin is held in place by a spring, not a particularly strong spring, but adequate for the angled hits the exploder was designed for. When a torpedo strikes at an angle, the plunger compresses gradually, releasing the firing pin smoothly to strike the detonator. But when a torpedo hits straight on, at 90 degrees, the kind of perfect shot every submarine commander aims for, the plunger doesn't compress gradually. It stops dead. The sudden deceleration from 46 knots to 0 in a fraction of a second generates enormous force. And that force, instead of being absorbed by a gradual compression, gets transmitted directly to the firing pin. The firing pin, it turns out, isn't strong enough. Under the shock of a direct hit, it crumples, it jams, it fails to strike the detonator with enough force to trigger the explosion. The perfect shot, the shot every submarine commander trains for, the shot that should guarantee a kill, is the one most likely to produce a dud. Lockwood stares at the mechanism for a long moment. You're telling me our torpedoes work better when we miss? When we hit at an angle, yes, sir. A glancing blow compresses the plunger gradually. The firing pin functions as designed, but a perpendicular hit. The engineer trails off. Jams the mechanism, Lockwood finishes. He thinks about the patrol reports he's read, the near misses that exploded, the perfect hits that didn't, the submarine commanders who were told they'd missed when they'd actually hit too well. How long have we known about this? We didn't know, Admiral. Not until Commander Daspit's patrol. The contact exploder was tested against nets and steel plates, but never against an actual armored ship hull at combat speed. This is the first time anyone's examined an unexploded torpedo that we know hit its target. Lockwood turns to his staff officers. Gentlemen, we have 3 options. First, we report this to the Bureau of Ordnance and wait for them to design, test, manufacture, and deliver a new firing pin, based on their response time for the depth mechanism and magnetic exploder that will take approximately forever. Second, we tell our submarine commanders to aim for glancing blows instead of direct hits, which contradicts everything we've taught them and reduces our chances of hitting at all. Third, we fix it ourselves. Sir, the Bureau has had 2 years to fix these torpedoes, Lockwood interrupts. Our submarines have been operating with an 80% failure rate while the Bureau insists nothing is wrong. I'm not waiting for Washington anymore. He turns to the senior engineer. Can we design a better firing pin? Something stronger that won't jam on direct impact? Yes, sir. I'd need to run some tests, calculate the forces involved, but yes. We could manufacture one here on Oahu. The machine shops at the base have the capability. How long? 2 weeks to design and test, another week to manufacture enough for the submarine force. You have 1 week total, Lockwood says. Our submarines are going back on patrol. I want working torpedoes in their tubes when they do. It's an order that could end his career. He's authorizing unauthorized modifications to a weapon system using Navy resources without Bureau approval, and essentially declaring that 2 decades of engineering by the Bureau of Ordnance was fundamentally flawed. If the modified firing pins fail, if a submarine is lost because of an exploder failure, Lockwood will be court-martialed. But if it works, American submarines will finally have the weapon they should have had on December 7, 1941. The engineers get to work. August 1943, submarine base. Pearl Harbor, torpedo shop. The machine shop runs 24 hours a day. Lathes spin, cutting tools bite into steel, and engineers huddle over blueprints making calculations by hand. They're designing a firing pin that can withstand the shock of a direct hit while still striking the detonator with enough force to trigger the explosion. The challenge is balancing strength with sensitivity. Make the firing pin too strong and it won't release when the torpedo hits at an angle. You'll get failures on glancing blows. Make it too weak and it will continue to jam on direct hits. The engineers run test after test, using a drop hammer to simulate impact forces, measuring the crush strength of different spring configurations, calculating the shock loads generated by a 3,000-pound torpedo hitting steel at 46 knots. Commander Paul Armstrong oversees the project, a Naval Academy engineering graduate who's spent years working with torpedo mechanisms. He knows they're in uncharted territory. The Bureau of Ordnance has laboratories, testing facilities, and teams of engineers who've devoted careers to torpedo development. Pearl Harbor has a machine shop and 1 week. But Pearl Harbor also has something the Bureau lacks: urgency born from watching men die because of faulty weapons. On the 5th day, Armstrong believes they have a solution. The new firing pin is heavier, with a stronger spring and a modified release mechanism that can handle both direct and angled impacts. But belief isn't enough. They need proof. They requisition an unexploded torpedo from depot stock and modify its exploder with the new firing pin. Then they face a problem. How do you test a live torpedo without actually firing it at a ship? They can't spare a target vessel. They can't risk an accidental explosion that might damage the harbor facilities. Armstrong comes up with a solution that's either brilliant or insane. They'll fire the torpedo at the submerged cliffs on Oahu's eastern shore, solid rock that will provide impact resistance similar to a ship's armored hull. They'll set the warhead to safe so it can't actually detonate, but the contact exploder will still function, and they can examine the mechanism afterward to see if the firing pin worked. Admiral Lockwood personally observes the test. A submarine fires the modified torpedo at the underwater cliff face from 800 yards, the same range as a typical combat shot. The torpedo strikes the rock with a solid impact that shudders through the water. Divers recover it an hour later. Armstrong carefully opens the nose cone and examines the contact exploder. The firing pin has released perfectly. It struck the detonator with enough force that had the warhead been armed, the torpedo would have detonated. No jamming, no failure. They test 5 more torpedoes, 5 more perfect functions. "Start manufacturing," Lockwood orders. The machine shops shift into high gear. Every available lathe is dedicated to producing the new firing pins. Machinists work in shifts, turning out parts with the precision required for explosive mechanisms. Each pin is individually tested, measured, and inspected. Within a week, they have enough to refit every torpedo in the Pearl Harbor depot. Lockwood calls in his submarine commanders. "Gentlemen, we've modified the contact exploders. The new firing pins should function on direct hits, but I need to be clear about what we're doing here. These modifications are unauthorized. If you're uncomfortable carrying unauthorized ordnance, I'll understand. We can load your boats with standard torpedoes. Not a single commander requests standard torpedoes. They returned to patrol in September 1943, carrying torpedoes with unauthorized firing pins designed by engineers who were told to ignore official procedures and fix the weapon themselves. It's the culmination of a 6-month effort by an admiral who refused to accept that his submariners were wrong and the Bureau was right. Now comes the real test. Combat. September 1943. Waters off Formosa. The USS Wahoo penetrates the harbor at Wewak, New Guinea in broad daylight, a feat of either supreme confidence or supreme recklessness. Commander Dudley Morton, known throughout the submarine force as Mush for his aggressive tactics, has spotted a convoy of Japanese ships in the harbor and decided to attack despite the shallow water, coastal guns, and near certainty of being trapped inside. Morton's executive officer, Richard O'Kane, calls out ranges and bearings. Freighter, bearing 085, range 1,200 yards. Second freighter, bearing 090, range 1,000 yards. "Final bearing and shoot," Morton says, his voice carrying the calm of a man who's done this 100 times. "Set. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. 3 torpedoes with modified firing pins race toward the anchored freighters. The first hits amidships and explodes. A massive detonation tears the freighter's midsection apart. The second strikes near the bow of the second freighter and explodes. The third hits the stern of the first freighter and explodes." In the conning tower, the crew watches in stunned silence as their torpedoes do what they're supposed to do: explode. 3 shots, 3 hits, 3 explosions. No duds, no failures. "Well, I'll be damned," someone whispers. Morton grins. "All ahead full. Let's get out of here before they figure out what hit them." The Wahoo escapes the harbor with depth charges exploding in her wake, but she's sunk 3 ships in a single attack. When Morton returns to Pearl Harbor, his patrol report reads like a submariner's fantasy. 19 torpedoes fired, 15 hits, 15 explosions, 9 ships sunk. The stories spread through the submarine force. The USS Harder sinks 5 destroyers in 4 days, each one with a single torpedo that explodes on impact. The USS Tang sinks 10 ships in a single patrol. The USS Silversides returns from the South China Sea with 14 kills. American submarines, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, have torpedoes that work. The impact on the Pacific War is immediate and devastating. For Japan, the island nation's entire war economy depends on imported resources: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore from China, food from Korea. Every ton of material must travel by ship. And now, American submarines are destroying those ships at a catastrophic rate. In 1942, American submarines sank approximately 180 Japanese merchant ships, an average of 1 every 2 days, hampered by torpedo failures. In the second half of 1943, with working torpedoes, that number doubles. By 1944, American submarines are sinking more than 500 Japanese ships per year, 1 every 17 hours. The Japanese merchant fleet, which began the war with 6 million tons of shipping, is reduced to less than 2 million tons by 1945. Japan's war economy strangles. Factories close for lack of raw materials. Refineries shut down for lack of crude oil. The population begins to starve as food shipments from the Asian mainland are cut off. The Imperial Japanese Navy, dependent on oil to fuel its warships, is forced to station its remaining fleet near the oil fields in Indonesia because there isn't enough fuel to bring the ships home. American submarines become the most cost-effective weapon system in the Pacific. They comprise less than 2% of the U.S. Navy, but account for 55% of Japanese shipping losses. Every ton of supplies that doesn't reach Japan is a ton the Japanese military doesn't have. Every ship sunk is a ship that can't carry reinforcements to Pacific Islands or evacuate wounded soldiers from captured territories. Admiral Lockwood's unauthorized fixes, the depth compensation, the magnetic exploder deactivation, and especially the redesigned firing pin, transform American submarines from a frustrated force into Japan's worst nightmare. But the cost was paid in the first 18 months of the war. American submarines lost during that period often died because their torpedoes failed. Boats that had to press attacks longer than necessary, fire more torpedoes than they should have needed, remain exposed to counterattack because the first spread of torpedoes were duds. The USS Growler was damaged in a surface engagement after her torpedoes failed to sink a gunboat. The USS Trigger survived depth charging because she missed a convoy she should have destroyed. The submarines and crews that were lost will never be recovered. November 1943. Bureau of Ordnance Headquarters, Washington, D.C. When Admiral Lockwood's report reaches Washington, complete with data from Pearl Harbor's unauthorized tests, combat results from submarines using modified firing pins, and a carefully worded request that the Bureau acknowledge the torpedo defects, the response is bureaucratic fury. The Bureau of Ordnance has spent 20 years developing the Mark 14 torpedo. They've invested millions of dollars, employed hundreds of engineers, and staked their professional reputations on its effectiveness. Admitting that the weapon was fundamentally flawed from the beginning would be admitting that 2 decades of work was wasted. It would mean accepting that submarine commanders in the field discovered defects that laboratory engineers missed. It would require acknowledging that an admiral at Pearl Harbor, working with limited resources, solved problems that the Bureau's sophisticated testing facilities failed to identify. The Bureau's official response, when it finally comes, is a masterpiece of deflection. The depth mechanism's 10-foot error was within acceptable tolerances given the variables of water temperature, salinity, and torpedo maintenance. The magnetic exploder's premature detonations were caused by improper handling by submarine crews. The contact exploder's failures were the result of incorrect firing solutions by submarine commanders. None of it was the Bureau's fault, but the Bureau also quietly begins implementing changes. New depth mechanisms are designed and shipped to the Pacific. The magnetic exploder is officially deactivated, though the Bureau frames it as a tactical adjustment rather than an admission of failure. And while they never officially acknowledge Lockwood's firing pin modification, new torpedoes arriving from the United States in late 1943 have firing pins that are suspiciously similar to the ones Pearl Harbor's machine shops produced. The torpedo crisis exposes a systemic failure in American military procurement. The Mark 14 was never adequately tested because live fire tests were expensive and peacetime budgets were tight. When war came, the Bureau was so invested in the torpedo's supposed excellence that they rejected field reports of its failures. The institutional culture prioritized protecting reputations over fixing problems. Submarine commanders, who risked their lives on every patrol, knew something was wrong from the beginning. But the system was designed to dismiss their concerns. Officers in Washington, who'd never heard a torpedo hit without exploding, were considered more credible than officers in the Pacific who watched it happen repeatedly. Engineering theory was valued over combat experience. It took an admiral willing to commit career suicide, conducting unauthorized tests, issuing unauthorized orders, and directly challenging the Bureau's authority to force the changes that should have been made before the war started. The lessons should have been obvious. Test your weapons realistically, listen to the people who use them, and fix problems instead of blaming the operators. But bureaucracies learn slowly, and by the time the Mark 14's defects were finally acknowledged, thousands of Japanese merchant ships had survived attacks they should have lost, and dozens of American submarines had been put at unnecessary risk. December 1943. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Admiral Lockwood sits in his office, reading patrol reports that now make for much more pleasant reading. The USS Swordfish has sunk 4 ships in the East China Sea. The USS Sculpin has destroyed a convoy off the Philippines. The USS Skate has torpedoed and sunk a Japanese cruiser. Hit rates are approaching 70%, a complete reversal from the 20% rates of early 1943. His gamble paid off. The unauthorized tests, the unapproved modifications, the direct defiance of Bureau of Ordnance orders, all of it was vindicated by results. American submarines are now doing what they were supposed to do from the beginning, strangling Japan's war economy by destroying its merchant fleet. But Lockwood knows how close it came to ending differently. If the modified firing pins had failed in combat, if a submarine had been lost because of a torpedo malfunction traced back to Pearl Harbor's modifications, his career would have ended in disgrace. He would have been relieved of command, possibly court-martialed, certainly blamed for any casualties that resulted. The fact that he was right wouldn't have mattered. The Navy doesn't reward officers who bypass the chain of command, even when their insubordination saves lives. Lockwood's success rested on 2 things: the courage to trust his submarine commanders over the Bureau's engineers, and the willingness to stake his career on that trust. He had to believe that the dozens of patrol reports describing torpedo failures were accurate, even when the Bureau insisted they were wrong. He had to be confident enough in his own judgment to order unauthorized tests and modifications, knowing that failure would destroy him professionally. Not every officer in his position would have made that choice. The safer path would have been to forward the patrol reports to Washington, express concern about the torpedo performance, and wait for the Bureau to act. That approach would have protected his career while allowing him to claim he'd tried to address the problem. The fact that submariners would continue dying with faulty weapons wouldn't have been his responsibility. He would have followed proper procedure. But Lockwood wasn't interested in the safer path. He was interested in winning the war. A knock on his door interrupts his thoughts. His aide enters with a message from Admiral Nimitz. "Congratulations on the submarine force's performance. Keep up the excellent work." Lockwood smiles. It's the closest he'll get to official acknowledgement that his unauthorized actions were the right call. The Navy will never formally admit that an admiral at Pearl Harbor had to fix weapons the Bureau of Ordnance couldn't. But Nimitz knows. The submarine commanders know. And most importantly, the Japanese are learning, one sinking ship at a time. May 1945, Tokyo Bay, Japan. The war is ending. Japan's merchant fleet has been reduced to a ghost of its former self, scattered remnants hiding in harbors, afraid to venture into waters patrolled by American submarines. The oil refineries stand silent for lack of crude. The factories are dark for lack of raw materials. The population is starving. American submarines didn't win the war alone. The island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, the strategic bombing of Japanese cities, the naval battles at Midway and the Philippine Sea all played crucial roles. But submarines severed the arteries that kept Japan's war machine functioning. Without fuel, without steel, without food, Japan couldn't sustain the fight, and it was all made possible by an admiral who refused to accept that his submariners were wrong when they said their torpedoes didn't work. The Mark 14 torpedo crisis remains one of the most egregious failures in American military procurement history. For 18 months, the U.S. Navy sent submarines into combat with weapons that had an 80% failure rate. The Bureau of Ordnance, rather than investigating the problems, blamed the operators. It took field modifications by commanders who were willing to risk their careers to finally produce a working weapon. The lessons are clear but often ignored. Realistic testing is not optional, operator feedback is not optional, and institutional pride cannot be allowed to override battlefield reality. Admiral Charles Lockwood retired from the Navy in 1947, decorated and honored for his leadership of the submarine force. He never received official recognition for fixing the torpedo crisis, because doing so would have required the Navy to admit the crisis existed. But every submarine commander who returned safely from patrol, every Japanese ship sent to the bottom, every ton of supplies that never reached Japan, all of it was part of his legacy. Lawrence Daspit, the commander who saved 2 unexploded torpedoes and provided the evidence that finally forced change, continued his submarine career and eventually reached the rank of Rear Admiral. His decision to preserve evidence instead of firing his last torpedoes changed the course of the Pacific War. The torpedo shop engineers at Pearl Harbor, who designed and manufactured firing pins in a week using nothing but machine shop tools and determination, returned to obscurity. Their names don't appear in most histories of World War II, but their work killed more Japanese ships than any single naval battle, and the submariners, the commanders who filed report after report describing torpedo failures, who pressed attacks despite knowing their weapons might not work, who risked their lives in enemy waters with tools that failed them more often than they succeeded. They became the most effective submarine force in naval history. Not because they had superior training or better boats or more courage than their enemies, but because they finally had weapons that worked. The Mark 14 torpedo crisis is a story about institutional failure and individual courage, about bureaucracies that prioritize self-protection over mission success, about leaders who trust their people even when it's dangerous to do so, and about the critical importance of testing your weapons before you send men to war with them. Japan learned this lesson in the most painful way possible. Their merchant fleet shattered, their war economy strangled, their defeat hastened by submarines armed with torpedoes that finally, after 18 months of failure, did exactly what they were supposed to do: explode.